Hello everyone, my name is Simon Dietz and I am the research lead for the Transition Pathway Initiative and Professor of Environmental Policy at the London School of Economics. And it's my great pleasure to present to you our State of Transition Report 2021. This report's been written by a large number of people and they are listed on the slide in front of you. Let me begin by just very briefly introducing TPI to you and also explaining to you what we try to achieve with this State of Transition report. And hopefully by now you'll be familiar with what TPI is and what it's trying to achieve. So I won't spend much time on that. We assess the progress being made by the world's highest emitting public companies on the transition to a low carbon economy. And we do so on the basis of companies' public disclosures. So we're a disclosure-based framework. Our framework aligns with the recommendations of TCFD, and we also provide data for the Climate Action 100+ initiative. And all of our data are open access and available on our online tool. Now, this is our fourth State of Transition report. We published our first in 2018, covering 105 companies in the 3 energy sectors. And this year's report contains data on 401 companies in 16 sectors. What we try to do with the State of Transition report is really take a step back from TPI's day-to-day and take stock of the overall progress being made by all the companies we assess on the low carbon transition. We look across our entire database using data that we've collected over the course of the last year. And it also provides us with an opportunity to conduct some more detailed research on fundamental issues. And I'll present a bit of that to you today. Now, in order to understand the results of our latest report, it's important to understand something of TPI's methodology and the data that we present on our online tool. So let me briefly explain that to you in case you're not already familiar with it. We assess companies in 2 ways. The first we call management quality, which is an indicator-based assessment of companies' management and governance of greenhouse gas emissions and the risks and opportunities arising from the low carbon transition. Our second way of assessing companies we call carbon performance. And this is a quantitative benchmarking of companies against international climate goals, specifically the national pledges and international commitments contained in the 2015 UN Paris Agreement on climate change. And these 2 sides to our assessment are largely complementary. Management quality looks at inputs and carbon performance looks at the ultimate outcome, emissions. And it's very important to look at both of those together when assessing a company. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, both of these assessments are based on company disclosures. Just a little more detail on management quality. Our management quality framework is based on 19 indicators. Each of these indicators you can think of as a management or governance practice. For example, having a climate change policy in place, disclosing operational emissions, or setting an emissions reduction target. We map these 19 indicators onto 5 levels of a staircase. You can see those in front of you here, going from level 0, that's companies that provide no evidence they're aware of climate change as a business issue, up to level 4, that's companies that are strategically assessing climate change. And the data for our management quality assessment are provided by TPI's data partner, FTSE Russell. Our carbon performance assessment, as I mentioned, tests in a quantitative way if companies' emissions and their emissions targets are aligned with the Paris goals. We mostly use 3 benchmark low carbon scenarios for this, one based on the national pledges that countries made to the 2015 Paris Agreement, a 2 degrees C scenario, and a below 2 degrees C scenario. The key feature of our carbon performance assessment is that it's sector-based because different sectors face different challenges in making the low carbon transition, including where emissions are concentrated in the value chain and how costly it is to reduce emissions. So we take a sectoral approach using the sectoral decarbonisation approach, or SDA, which is also being used by the Science Based Targets Initiative. For our low carbon scenarios, we mostly use the International Energy Agency, or IEA's scenarios, but we augment these with other sources where necessary. For example, in the autos sector, we use scenarios from the International Council for Clean Transportation. So with that introduction to our methodology and tool in hand, let me now walk you through the main results in our 2021 State of Transition report. And let me begin with management quality. So we've got 401 companies in our database now, and their average management quality score is 2.6. What does that mean? Well, it means that the average company in the TPI database is now just over halfway between level 2, which is building capacity on climate change, and level 3, which is integrating climate change into operational decision-making. More concretely, what that means is that most companies in the TPI database have now implemented 4 fundamental and basic carbon management practices. Firstly, they have a policy commitment on climate change. Secondly, they explicitly recognize climate change as a business issue. Thirdly, they disclose their operational, or in other words, scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. And fourthly, they've set some kind of emissions target, even if it's just qualitative. Now, 38% of companies are still on level 0, level 1, or level 2. And that means that those companies are yet to undertake some or all of the 4 basic carbon management practices that I've just described: having a policy, explicitly recognizing climate change as a business risk, disclosing operational emissions, and setting an emissions target. The remaining 62% of companies are on levels 3 or 4. Reaching level 4 requires a wider range of carbon management practices to be introduced, including assigning board responsibility for climate change, disclosing scope 3 emissions, and setting quantified emissions reduction targets. 14 companies have achieved level 4 star status this year. That means that they satisfy all relevant management quality indicators, and those companies are listed in our report. Let me now break down our management quality data by sector. So if we look at what we would call the core TPI sectors, where we sample all the largest public companies, then the leading sectors are electricity utilities with a management quality average score of 3.1, and diversified mining companies, which have the same average score, followed by chemicals companies, which have an average management quality score of 3. The worst performing sectors on management quality are firstly coal mining, with an average management quality score of 2, and worst of all, the international freight shipping sector with an average management quality score of 1.8. And between these leaders and laggards, we see sectors relatively uniformly distributed in their average management quality. We can also break our management quality data down indicator by indicator. And what we always observe when we do this is that companies tend to have implemented basic carbon management practices, but are less likely to have implemented more strategic practices. And you can see that in the chart on the right-hand side here, where a larger share of companies having implemented a carbon management practice is represented by a longer blue bar and a shorter red bar. You can see that more than 9 out of 10 companies in the TPI universe can demonstrate they acknowledge climate change as a business issue. That's indicator number 1. And similarly, more than 9 out of 10 have a policy commitment to act on climate change. Conversely, less than 3 out of 10 companies have implemented some of the more advanced practices down at the bottom of the chart, including undertaking climate scenario planning. Among the more advanced indicators, we find that companies perform relatively well on having climate risk management processes. That's indicator number 12. And setting long-term emissions targets. That's indicator 14. So what this really shows is that companies are relatively comfortable in approaching climate change through risk management and target setting lenses. On the other hand, what we also find is that companies seem to struggle on key indicators at what we might call the corporate policy interface. In other words, 3 of our indicators evaluate companies based on how constructively they engage with the broader policy sphere. Indicator 10 looks at whether companies can demonstrate they support domestic and international efforts to mitigate climate change. Question 11 looks at whether companies disclose their membership and involvement in trade associations that are engaged in climate issues. And indicator 19 looks at whether companies manage inconsistencies that may arise between their own positions on climate issues and those of these trade associations. And we find that companies are relatively weak on these 3 indicators around this issue of broader engagement with the policy sphere. And this is important because climate change is a problem replete with market failures, requiring ultimately some form of government intervention as well as private sector action. We provide a sectoral breakdown of our indicator by indicator data in the main report. So I refer you to the report for that. Now, one of the most important things that we can do in our State of Transition report is look at trends. And the key message here is that on aggregate, there has not been much progress on management quality since last year. To see this, let's start with trend data on the 328 companies that we have, which we have assessed in the last year and that we also assessed in the previous cycle. Of those 328 companies, 69% have stayed on the same level as last year. 17% have moved up at least 1 level, but 14% have moved down at least 1 level. Most movement, as you can see in the Sankey diagram on the right-hand side here, is between levels 3 and 4. So a significant number of companies have moved up from level 3 to level 4, but actually a larger number of companies have moved down from level 4 to level 3 over the last year. We've conducted some further analysis of this issue and established that just a few of our management quality indicators are responsible for most of this movement. In particular, indicator 10 and indicator 11, 2 of these indicators that address the corporate policy interface. And the fact that there's a lot of downward movement attributable to these 2 indicators hints that consistency of disclosure could be an issue for companies here. In other words, that from year to year, they are not perhaps taking care to consistently disclose up-to-date information about their lobbying activities. On levels 0 to 2, we see less movement, but what movement we tend to see is upwards, as you can see down towards the bottom of the chart with the fatter green lines compared with the thinner red lines. Now, as well as looking at trends of companies that we've assessed at least twice, the other thing that changes from one year to the next is we add new companies. And this year we've added 73 new companies to the TPI universe. And on average, these companies tend to start at a lower base of management quality. So 60% of the newly added companies are on levels 0 to 2, and their the average management quality score of the newly added 73 companies is just 2.0. Consequently, adding new companies has actually brought the average management quality score of the whole TPI universe down from 2.7 to 2.6. It's impossible to be exactly sure of why newly added companies perform less well. We just don't have enough data to demonstrate cause and effect statistically. But two of the most likely explanations are, firstly, their relatively small size, and secondly, geography, the fact that a disproportionate number of these newly added companies are headquartered in emerging markets. And we've found before that such companies tend to have lower management quality. I'm now going to move on to carbon performance, our second way of assessing companies' climate action. In this year's report, we cover 292 companies in 10 sectors on carbon performance. That's an increase of 54 companies on last year. And in the last year, we've added the diversified mining sector to our carbon performance assessment for the first time. We also look out to 2050 in all sectors now, whereas previously we only did so in the oil and gas sector. Although we look at alignment with the Paris goals, both with respect to 2030 and 2050. And both horizons are important because it won't be enough for all companies to just align with the Paris goals in 2050, as temperature increase depends on cumulative carbon emissions between now and 2050. That's why it's important to look at both 2030 and 2050. We've actually drafted an explainer in the report which discusses this issue in more detail. Having said that, if you look at the pie charts in front of you, you'll see that the pattern of alignment is actually very similar in 2030 and 2050. A little more than 1/3 of companies align with one of our Paris Agreement benchmarks, and about 1/5 of companies align with our 2 degrees scenario or our below 2 degrees scenario. But most companies are either not aligned or they provide unsuitable disclosure for assessing their carbon performance. Like with management quality, we observe in existing TPI companies some modest improvement on last year, particularly in terms of alignment with below 2 degrees, and also a falling share of companies providing insufficient disclosure. Also, like with management quality, we find that the addition of these new companies tends to slightly drag down aggregate carbon performance. I'll now show you a sectoral breakdown of our carbon performance data, and I'll focus on 2050 for this slide. You can see that alignment with the Paris Agreement benchmarks is highest in electricity and diversified mining and lowest in airlines and oil and gas. Although in oil and gas, our assessment doesn't include the most recent announcements, for example, by Royal Dutch Shell. There are different stories at play here. As far as electricity is concerned, this is in many parts of the world a tightly regulated sector. It's technologically relatively more straightforward with mature low carbon technologies like solar and wind, and new technologies like battery storage improving fast. As far as diversified mining is concerned, we've got a special feature on this sector in our State of Transition report. Companies that can align with the Paris goals in diversified mining typically have a production or commodity mix, which contains a low share of carbon intensive commodities like coal, fossil fuels, and iron ore, and or they have relatively ambitious long-term targets covering their downstream Scope 3 emissions. In airlines, well, aviation is well known as a relatively hard to abate sector, and there is also a specific issue with indeterminate reliance on offsetting to meet long-term goals, while oil and gas is clearly a sector that's existentially challenged by the low carbon transition, and where companies are only just now beginning to get to grips with their long-term climate strategies. This slide shows alignment with the Paris goals in 2050. There are more marked differences between 2030 alignment and 2050 alignment at the sector level than there are on aggregate. And some sectors, like autos, cement and electricity, tend to show stronger alignment in 2050 than they do in 2030, which might imply that companies in these sectors are backloading their emissions efforts to towards mid-century, which is of some concern to us. So we're encouraging investors to keep an eye on companies' interim targets to make sure that they don't exceed our cumulative emissions budget. Now, for most companies, the key to aligning with the Paris goals is setting a sufficiently ambitious emissions target. So in our State of Transition report, we make a deep dive into the data on companies' emissions targets. We start by asking the question, how ambitious are companies' targets? And the answer is that most companies' emissions targets are not ambitious enough. So using the results of our carbon performance assessment here, we find that only 30% of companies with emissions targets are aligned with below 2 degrees. This is a different number to alignment with below 2 degrees that I gave you a few slides ago, because this only looks at companies with targets. That said, we do see an encouraging momentum behind what we might tentatively call genuine net zero targets. So a year ago, 14 companies in our database had what we would think of as genuine net zero targets, genuine in the sense of covering their most material emissions. 1 year later, this number has more than doubled to 35 companies, of which 23 are in electricity. Now, there are many more net zero targets out there than just these 35, but for many of them, the problem is they cover a limited scope of life cycle emissions. So for example, in the oil and gas sector, net zero targets only sometimes include the all-important emissions from use of sold products, and none, at least at the time of our assessment, included third-party energy sales. Similarly, in autos, several companies have net zero targets relating to their manufacturing process, but those targets don't cover the emissions performance of the vehicles that they sell. So a net zero target does not necessarily mean that a company's material emissions will reach net zero, and we're encouraging investors to pay close attention to this issue. A second question that we ask in this section is how long-term are companies, or how forward-looking are companies' emissions targets? And encouragingly, we find that companies' targets are becoming increasingly long-term. What this slide shows you is that over successive TPI assessment cycles, what is the average target year of companies with targets in each sector? So if you're moving from left to right on this chart, then the target year is moving further into the future. Now, clearly, as each year goes by, we would hope that the company's target year increases by at least 1 year. But what we're finding is that it's actually increasing by more than that. And the average target year for all sectors in our analysis is now 2039. Up from 2032 last year. Third question we ask in this analysis is, are ambitious long-term targets underpinned by intermediate targets? So it's obviously an encouraging sign when a company sets a net zero 2050 target, but from the point of view of judging whether the company is serious about meeting that target, and also from the point of view of making sure its cumulative emissions between now and the target year don't exceed the world's carbon budget, we want to see intermediate targets. Of the 42 companies that we looked at that have set targets aligned with below 2 degrees, 19 are yet to set any intermediate targets, and we encourage investors to focus their engagement on that issue for these companies. Lastly, we ask perhaps the most important question: are companies actually on track to hit their targets? I'll take a moment to just talk you through this slide. The orange and red bars show by how much companies have reduced their emissions intensity over the last 5 or 6 years, between 2014 and 2019. So they track historical annual emissions reductions. The blue bars look at how much companies would need to reduce their emissions each year to meet their 2030 and 2050 targets. The fact that the orange and red bars are typically shorter than the blue bars indicates that companies have not been reducing their emissions fast enough historically to reach their future targets. So in most sectors, companies are not reducing emissions fast enough to hit their 2030 targets. And in no sector do we see companies reducing emissions fast enough to meet their 2050 targets. So there's a lot more work to be done. Interestingly, what we also find is that companies with targets are reducing their emissions slightly faster than companies without targets. So that comes from here in the chart from the comparison of the orange bar with the red bar for each sector. The orange bar is all companies in the sector. The red bar is just those companies with targets. And we find that companies with targets or reduced their emissions on average by 1.9% between 2014 and 2019, whereas the average annual reduction rate for all companies was just 1.6%. So this does suggest that companies with targets, it shows that companies with targets have reduced their emissions faster. It suggests that target setting might be a precursor to more rapid emissions reductions, although this isn't a claim, a definitive claim of cause and effect. Let me summarize my presentation for you now. This is our 4th annual State of Transition report, covering 401 companies from 16 business sectors. We find when we assess management quality that most companies now have basic carbon management practices in place, but most companies are still not taking a truly strategic approach to the issue. And progress is slow. Average management quality is actually marginally lower than it was last year when it was 2.7. And this is partly attributable to the addition of new companies, which tend to be smaller and more likely to be headquartered in emerging markets. But we also see limited progress among companies that we previously scored. As far as carbon performance is concerned, we see 15% of companies now align with below 2 degrees C in 2050, 2% align with 2 degrees, but the majority of companies either are not aligned or provide insufficient disclosure for us to assess them. And the pattern of alignment at the aggregate level is similar when the time horizon is 2030. Companies are not yet reducing their emissions fast enough to meet their targets. That was one of the major conclusions of our deep dive into corporate targets. But I want to end on a positive note. And so although carbon performance remains weak, I would emphasize that we do see some promising signs. As far as companies that we've tracked for at least 2 years are concerned, slightly more companies are aligned with below 2 degrees C, and slightly fewer companies are now providing insufficient disclosure for us to assess them. Companies' emissions targets are becoming longer term, so companies' average target year is going further into the future. And we're seeing this trend towards more what we're calling genuine net zero targets, targets covering companies' material emissions sources. But it's important to watch out for the fact that a net zero target is not necessarily really a net zero target. It may not cover companies' most significant emissions sources. I'll finish up by just pointing out that there are other parts of our State of Transition report which I've not had time to present to you today. Firstly, we break down our management quality and carbon performance data by geography. Secondly, we explore the link between management quality and carbon performance. Are they correlated? And is past management quality predictive of future emissions reductions? As this is our fourth State of Transition report, we now have more data which we can use to assess these questions, so we do that. As I mentioned, we have a special sector focus on diversified mining, and there is an explainer on how to interpret alignment with the Paris Agreement benchmarks in our carbon performance assessment. So that's it for my presentation. I'll remind you of our terms of use as contained in our disclaimer. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.